What's going on, guys? Billy here, and the DJI Mavic Air 2 has a brand new video shooting mode called HDR Video. Now, to fully understand exactly what HDR Video is and how it works, we first got to break down that acronym, HDR. It stands for High Dynamic Range, and as defined here by Vimeo, dynamic range refers to the range of which a camera can successfully capture the lightest and darkest areas of an image without losing detail. And of course, high dynamic range means that a camera has a lot of dynamic range, and this is very good because it gives you a properly exposed image across the board. It doesn't make you choose whether you want to expose for the highlights, thus completely destroying the shadows, or vice versa, exposing for the shadows and then totally blowing out those highlights. Now, the reason that I have these four drones in front of me, the Anafi, the Skydio 2, the Autel Evo 2, and the Mavic Air 2, is because all of them have HDR video in some capacity. Now, even though it's brand new to DJI's lineup of drones, of course, it's not brand new to drones in general or cameras in general, because these three drones that came before the Mavic Air 2 have HDR video. And in this video, what I want to do is go over exactly what HDR video does, how it can help you shoot better video, and of course, I'm going to compare it to these four drones. Now, before I get way too far ahead of myself here, I should probably mention that HDR photography has been around a lot longer than the practice of, say, shooting HDR video. And the reason behind that is just because of the sheer complexity of shooting HDR video. So in order to shoot a photo with high dynamic range, you're taking multiple photos at different exposures, a dark exposure, a middle exposure, and then a bright exposure, to then combine together to give you a photo with higher dynamic range. It's very simple, and it can be done over the course of a couple of seconds. Shooting these multiple photos, you could use the in-camera HDR feature that really any drone has now or any camera has now, or you can blend them together by shooting bracketed photos later when you're, say, in Lightroom or Photoshop. But here's the thing is, how do you do that with video? How do you take multiple frames and combine them together with a moving image? That's why HDR video is so hard. And as we've seen HDR video be implemented in different drones over the past years, again, the Anafi, the Skydio, the Evo, and now the Mavic Air 2, I think the Mavic Air 2 delivers HDR video that's actually worth using, which is saying something because I actually find myself using it and I find myself getting better shots because of it. So I ran a series of tests amongst the four drones that I mentioned here in this video to get a better understanding of exactly how the HDR video shooting mode worked, and also to see if it could ultimately give me a more desirable image than the regular shooting mode could give me that basically any drone has. So the first test that I ran here is just simply looking down at the side of my apartment. I wanted to test the camera's dynamic range. So the top portion of the building is in bright sunlight. It's well lit by the sun, while the bottom half is in a nice deep shadow. Now, the first drone up here is the Parrot Anafi, and the dynamic range really isn't all that good. Of course, it's properly exposing for the top portion of the image, but you lose a lot of detail down there in the shadows. I can barely pick up how many cars are down there in the parking lot. But of course, once we turn on HDR video, those shadows are boosted, but I feel like it kind of destroys the rest of the image. Like, there's definitely a color shift. It's a little bit more green now. It might be a little bit more warm. Of course, I could fix that in post, but regardless, it feels like the highlights are a little bit blown out now. And when we begin to look at some of the real world examples that I took from the Parrot Anafi, I don't know, I feel like I'd rather shoot in that standard shooting mode opposed to the HDR shooting mode, because I feel like those highlights are just way too blown out. It almost reverses the image. It exposes for the shadows and then blows out the highlights. Now, moving on here, the next drone that we'll take a look at is the Skydio 2, and I've got to admit that when this drone first came out, I discredited the HDR video shooting mode just because in my first impressions, I didn't really think that it did all that much, but after seeing the HDR video mode in the Parrot Anafi, my thought has totally changed. So of course, this is just the regular shooting mode from the Skydio 2. We've got the side of the building here, and it does a really good job at properly exposing the entire image. I feel like the dynamic range right out of the camera is already pretty good, but going over to now the HDR video clip, I feel like it actually doesn't do that much boosting of the shadows, but instead it brings the highlights down a little bit. In fact, I'm noticing that it kind of lacks a little bit of contrast. Like, the image isn't as punchy as I would want. And looking back at some of these test clips that I shot, I certainly do prefer using the HDR video mode over the standard video mode, but also I feel like it might be a little bit too cool for my liking, and I don't think it works properly in every single scenario. So while I think it probably comes in second here, you'll certainly see in just a couple of minutes why I think the Mavic Air 2 actually gets this HDR video shooting mode right. Now moving on here, the third drone that we're looking at is the Autel Evo 2. Specifically speaking, I've got the 8K camera mounted on here. It's not the Pro model. And I've got to say, right off of the gate, I'm a little bit unimpressed from the dynamic range. Looking down in the shadows, you do get a good amount of detail. It certainly is better than what the Parrot Anafi delivered, but I feel like it's lacking contrast in a way. Like those shadows are being artificially boosted, almost like HDR video is already turned on. And my disappointment continues when HDR video is turned on. This image just across the board looks washed out. The shadows definitely are boosted, but the highlights are blown out. I feel like it lacks a lot of contrast, and it's also leaning towards like a magenta tint, and it's a little bit too cool for my liking. And when we look at some of these shots that I've taken with the Evo 2, specifically speaking with HDR video turned on, the whole thing just looks fake. The colors look pastel-y. I feel like the shadows are not really all that much boosted, and the highlights are a little bit blown out. And when we look at just the standard shooting mode coming from the Evo 2 with no HDR video turned on, I would almost prefer this image and then just fix it up in post. So now that we've established a really good base and a really good understanding of what HDR video looks like in some other drones on the market, it's now time to see how DJI has done with their HDR video shooting mode in the Mavic Air 2. So of course I ran the same tests with this drone. I pointed it down at the side of the building here at my apartment complex, and I've got to say right off of the gate, the dynamic range of this camera in just the standard shooting mode is great. It does a good job at properly exposing for the brighter part of the image along the top. Of course, that's where the sun is hitting the building, but also it preserves a lot of detail down there in the shadows. Like I can properly pick out what cars are down there, maybe what the make and what the model are, just because of how much detail is down there. Now, when we flip over to the HDR video mode, there's not that much of a difference. In fact, personally, if I had to say, it looked a little bit worse for my liking. Like maybe the top portion of the image is a little bit too overexposed. And when I look back at some of the shots that I got, that I also got with some of the other drones, I almost felt like I'd prefer not using HDR video and just sticking with the standard shooting mode because the dynamic range was already good right out of the box. So of course, I had to get to the bottom of this. I continued to test it out, and I waited for the sun to get down a little bit lower so that the entire area around my apartment complex was in a nice deep shadow. So I raised up and over my apartment complex. I have the sun back there, of course, setting over the mountains. And you know what? This is a tough shot for any camera. It doesn't matter if it's got HDR. It doesn't matter if it's got the best dynamic range in the world. If you're looking directly at the sun, you're not going to get that good of an image, but I still feel like it does a good job at preserving some of the details down there in the shadows at the expense of totally pretty much blowing out the sky. But when you turn on HDR video, wow, the difference is insane. I still am shocked when I look at these two different examples. I feel like this HDR video mode gives you a nice properly exposed sky. You've got the sun, it's not totally blown out. You can see a little bit of color still left there up in the sky. You can see some of the clouds next to the sun, and you can see those towers out in the back right. But also the foreground is properly exposed. You can see some detail down there, and the difference is night and day. Now, that example that I just shared with you guys might be a little bit overkill. I can't tell you guys the last time that I shot a video clip with my camera pointing directly at the sun. Although now that I think about it, I feel like I probably never did that because I didn't think I had a camera that could handle that type of dynamic range or that type of shot. But with HDR video on the Mavic Air 2, it does a really good job at properly exposing the entire image, the sky and the ground. I mean, again, the difference was night and day. Now, I did do a little bit more shooting in some normal circumstances, not pointed directly at the sun. And in this shot, as I'm strolling down Main Street here, a very empty Main Street, might I add, here in Manayunk, shooting in that standard shooting mode by all means yields impressive results. Like this is a usable shot across the board. It does a really good job at properly exposing the image despite the sun being very low in the sky. Although the one complaint that I have is that the water on the left side of the image feels a little bit blown out. Like because the sun is so low, there's a very heavy glare coming up off of the water. But when we turn HDR video mode on, it does a really good job at knocking those highlights down and giving us a properly exposed image across the board amongst every single aspect of the frame. Now here's the thing. Here is the final takeaway that I want to give you guys about the Mavic Air 2 and its HDR video shooting mode. It is actually usable. It is actually something that I want to use, and it's something that I don't think hurts the image. So with the Anafi, with the Skydio 2, and with the Evo 2, I feel like there's some sort of trade-off to using HDR video. Like I feel like there's a color cast in the image, or I feel like sometimes the exposure gets all out of whack, or maybe the highlights are boosted while the shadows are also boosted. So rather than just boost the shadows, it's really boosting the whole entire image. Whereas with the HDR video on the Mavic Air 2, I've got no complaints. It does nothing but help me and give me a more properly exposed image. I guess the only complaint I have is like you can't shoot 4K video at 60 frames per second, but still, regardless, I'd rather have a perfectly exposed image using this HDR video shooting mode than shoot in a higher frame rate. Now, I'd love to hear what you guys have to think down in the comment section below. I pretty much am only strictly shooting HDR video with this drone. There's a little bit of a secret to it. Like I feel like when you turn HDR video on immediately, it has to do a little bit of scanning of the image to make sure it's implementing the HDR video properly and it's not hurting the image. So you might notice that when you turn HDR video mode on, it initially won't make these drastic changes, but as you continue to fly with it turned on, it does a really good job at exposing the entire image. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below about HDR video shooting with the Mavic Air 2, and as always, I'll talk to you later. Peace.